I normally start off podcasts with this like, hi guest, welcome to the podcast bit, but I feel like we already know each other too well for that. So,
Yeah.
Ale, how are you doing?
Well, I can't complain. Excited to be here and chat with you about all things data science job hunt related. And yeah, let's get to it.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, Alejandro's been really a central part of Sharpest Minds for a while now. He's been running our mentee operations. He's also been doing a whole bunch of like big picture stuff company wise, but he spends a lot of time talking mentees. And that's why we wanted to have this chat. We wanted to kind of expose how we at Sharpest Minds think about the job search strategy part of things, the job search tactics that we found work really well, the kind of data critically that we have found really informs job application strategies. And so that's really what we wanted to discuss today. We have a bunch of plots that we put together. These reflect data from like thousands of applications, hundreds of mentees, that kind of thing. So we're going to share all that. And I wanted to get Ale here so you could comment on like some of the things you've seen firsthand. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen so we can get these plots up. Let me just see here. There we go. I think that's going to work. Okay, cool. So the first plot that we're looking at here is the application response rate. So should probably preface this. 3 different job application strategies that we tell mentees to focus on that we've studied in great depth at Sharpest Minds. They're the idea of sending a cold email to the person you want to reach out to at a company. And maybe Ale later you can speak to like who you should be reaching out to and how and so on.
Definitely.
Awesome. And then sending a LinkedIn DM and a job board application. What you're seeing here are the response rates we've seen across the thousands and thousands of applications that we've logged through our platform, basically, for each of these strategies. So maybe I'll stop here, and Ale, can you like I guess talk about some of the most salient take-home messages you get from this plot?
Sure. So the first thing that I want to highlight is like the importance of having like a quantitative approach to this, because most of the people that I speak to when they're like beginning to go through the job hunting process or have come to us because they've been executing a job hunt that hasn't yielded the results they wanted and they're like, what am I doing wrong? A lot of it basically reduces down to not looking at the data. So a perfect example is like many people will usually just default to the path of least resistance, something like LinkedIn Easy Apply, where you're just clicking a button and sending out a ton of resumes and you're doing this like spray and pray approach. And it feels like you're doing a lot of like, you're being very productive because you're getting a lot of applications and like a lot of shots on goal. But what most people don't realize is like the expected value of each one of those is actually very low. And what I love about this is that you basically visualize that in this plot where you're like, okay, job board applications, very easy to do, but look at the response rate. You're in single digits. And I gotta say, given that this is an average distribution, there's like some skew to these numbers, right? Because there's some people that will get much closer to zero. And then there's some people that will get much higher response rates. And the key differentiator tends to be like your experience level. The more years of experience that you have, the more the application tracking software that a lot of companies use will reward you. But for most of our mentees and most people that are breaking into data science, they're looking for their first role, this will actually just penalize you because you don't have that experience just yet. So what we really try to basically reinforce with some of these strategies is this idea of looking for the third door. Like, don't go where the crowd is because you'll never rise above the noise. Instead, do things that other people aren't willing to do, like writing a really good cold email. And I think that's highlighted in the differences of response rates that you see in front of you now.
I do want to double down on your point on that job board 7% response rate. Like, don't expect to send job board applications out and get a 7% response rate. As Ale
Exactly.
said, these numbers are super skewed. So the median numbers we see are actually closer to 1 to 2% response rates. Like, so the median person gets about one interview invitation per 50 or 100 applications, which feels terrible, right? I mean, Ale, that's one part of
Yeah.
this story too, right? Is how does this stuff make you feel?
Exactly. So one really important thing to think about is the psychology of the job hunt, where you're wrestling against burnout, and there's a particular flavor to burning out on the job hunt, which is you're expending all this effort, but you don't see your progress. And with that lack of positive feedback from the market, it's very easy to get discouraged, and it's very easy to end up just saying like, "Screw it, I'm not going to apply for the next week because I just can't send out another application." Um, one of the key things that's like very important to remember about all this is that most of the feedback you're going to get from the market is either silence or rejection. And different people will have different thresholds for how much of this they can tolerate. But without having like a guiding compass, a metric, something that allows you to evaluate your performance a bit more proactively, with a bit more of like leading indicators, if you will, it's very easy to succumb to this. So one of the things that we're trying to do with all this is give everyone more of a 30,000 foot view, because any individual person in the market is only going to be able to rely on their feedback, anecdotes, and maybe some things that they read on the internet. Whereas here, we can basically connect you to what we've seen work across a giant spectrum of people like you, based on thousands upon thousands of applications. And in the aggregate, we can tell you, here's what you should expect. Here's how you should baseline yourself. And you can very easily see, hey, I'm above the line or below the line this week. And I think it just guides, it helps guide people a bit more. And so they feel less like lost in the wilderness and more like, here's the North Star and I just got to keep going in this direction and I'll eventually get there.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to something that I probably should have provided by way of context earlier, is like, where does this data come from? What is the source of this? What is the job search or tracking software really that we've deployed? And maybe you can explain that a little bit, Ali. Like, what is the job search assistant that, where this stuff comes from?
Definitely. So the job search assistant is basically our attempt to turn me into a robot so I can have a ton of conversations with a ton of people concurrently. Because normally what would happen is I would hop on a call with every single mentee and explain this to them and like educate them on how to think about job search strategy. For example, one thing that is very important to bear in mind when you're launching a job hunt is this idea of interview yield per unit of effort. Meaning you want to find the sustainable pattern for you to generate interviews, because the more interviews you generate, the higher the likelihood that one of them will convert into a job offer, and eventually that probability tips into one. But it has to be sustainable. So for example, if you're just spraying and praying job boards all day, yeah, it might feel like progress in the short term, but 6 months of that and you don't have any offers yet, it'll be dramatically easier to burn out. So obviously there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so many conversations that I can have. So what we did is we built software that would basically walk you through each step of this, from the high level view of like, here's how you should think about application strategies, to here's specific strategies that we recommend doing, here's how to execute them. And on the back end, here's some data on how those are performing in up-to-date, almost real time. So for example, we'll show you how to craft a cold email. We'll literally help you build it paragraph by paragraph. We'll explain to you who you should be targeting with these cold emails, because you don't want to just send it to anybody in the company. We show you how to identify hiring managers that are actually best positioned to do a ground truth assessment of your skills. And so we basically tried to package all of this in software. We gave it to our mentees, and to our great delight, they loved it and started using it a ton, which allowed us to be able to get more data, to draw more insights, to give even better advice on all of these fronts. And so that's where all these numbers come from.
Yeah, and I think that's worth keeping in mind too. Like the overarching goal here was always to provide mentees with context, like provide job seekers with context. It's so easy to apply to jobs and you don't hear back. You have no idea, like, is it me or is it just that this process is horrible,
Exactly.
that the response rates are just this? Like, if you got a 3% response rate on job board applications, like you send out 100, you get 3 interviews back, you might feel terrible about yourself, or you might take a look at the broader statistics, know that the median response rate is 1% to 2%, and go, oh, I'm actually beating that. That's great.
Right.
All of a sudden.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So this really gets to the core of all of it, which is, without proper context in the market, given the dynamic of like such a lack of positive feedback and such a risk for burnout, it can very easily devolve into like a negative spiral where you're just demoralized. You're seeing other people get hired. You're like reading these articles of like all the 10 different ways that you can get this interview and crush this. And you're expending a lot of effort, but it's like you're spinning your wheels, except like what you're really missing is the proper context, the proper perspective to understand like, no, actually, like here's where the baseline is at for people with your experience level, your educational attainment level, whatever it is. And baseline, benchmark yourself against that, not against your singular sliver of contact with the market, which is, as anybody who's hunted for a job in recent memory will tell you, is a very, very broken process full of inefficiencies. And so this just tries to like pierce a lot of that noise with a bit of signal, so that allows you to have a bit more context, and temper your expectations and make it easier for you to find, again, that sustainable pattern to generate interviews.
Awesome. And I think the last thing maybe worth mentioning too is like everybody has a different level of writing ability. So when you write a cold email or a LinkedIn message, like some people are ESL, some people just aren't great at writing, at crafting stuff. This is something that we've actually actively controlled for in these experiments that yield this data. So we literally have A/B tested. It's got to be hundreds or at least dozens of different email and cold email and LinkedIn message templates to find the ones that work best. And then we have our mentees take those and kind of customize them slightly. But the goal here really is to run a very controlled experiment. So when you look at one cold email from mentee or job seeker number one, and you compare it to a cold email from mentee or job seeker number two, like there really is consistency across the board. And that makes these numbers much more meaningful than they otherwise would be.
Exactly. Like we definitely have to control for a lot of the variance because like we're talking about humans here with different abilities, different experiences, different outlooks on things. And so obviously it's important to control for those factors as much as possible. And just to double click on something you just said, we've like field tested all of this advice and specifically all of like these templates for like cold email, LinkedIn reach outs. And one of the things that we built into the software is just a lot of those templates that they give you a starting off point. And one of the really cool things about it though is that this is something that gets continuously refreshed and replenished.
Right.
So as more people use it, as more people experiment with even new strategies or new pieces of copy, it gets fed back into the software, and it just gives the next mentee a leg up. So it's like this sort of turning the negative spiral of the job hunt by yourself into like a positive feedback loop in a positive sum game.
Awesome. Okay, so now with that preamble in place, what are we looking at here? I mean, like clearly it says cold emails, these controlled kind of A/B tested templated cold emails perform on a response rate basis. This is not interview rate. We'll get into the difference between responses and interviews in a minute. But in terms of just hearing back, it looks like cold emails are doing solidly better than LinkedIn. LinkedIn is doing solidly better than job board. And of course, we talked already about how job boards, in reality, this number is more like 1 to 2%, 1 to 3% for the median case. So what's going on here? Why are cold emails and LinkedIn doing so much better than job boards?
So the big takeaway here in terms of like the variance that you're seeing in response rates across these three different application strategies is basically like proof of work. So it's a lot more work to send a cold email to someone where you're researching the company, you're researching the role, you're researching the person, and you're sending a highly personalized note of, hey, this is who I am. I can tell this is what you guys are trying to solve with this role. Here's what I've done in the past that should signal my ability to deliver value in this particular setting. And if it makes sense to talk, let's hop on a call next week. Doing that well takes a lot more work, and so a lot less people do it. So it's like it's a much less crowded channel. Therefore, there's less noise. Therefore, it's easier for your signal to rise above it. With LinkedIn, there's like a bit less of that. It's also like a different channel in my opinion, in the sense that so LinkedIn reach outs is ostensibly finding hiring managers on LinkedIn or members of a data science team on LinkedIn and reaching out to them directly, like through DMs, to try and hop on a call with them and explore what it is they're looking for, to better understand A, if that's a role you should even apply for, and B, to try and connect even more directly with hiring managers through that process. More work than job boards, but there's a lot of people that just send like spammy messages on LinkedIn. So it's sometimes you get caught up in that like spam filter, not in the traditional sense of the word like you would in an email inbox, but rather in the sense that people have a slightly less proclivity to respond to LinkedIn DMs than like going straight into their inbox with a highly personalized note. And then finally, job boards, it's just, there's so many of them. And the first pass is being reviewed by a robot that's basically looking at keywords and timestamps on your resume. So that's the hardest way to stand out is with job boards, unless you already have a few years of experience, in which case you'll probably have a better yield, which is again why that number is kind of pulled up to 7 in the average case, and where the median is closer to 1 to 2%.
So it sounds like there are kind of two different factors here, one of which is as you said, proof of work. You're showing how much you care about this company. Companies really like to be flattered. They like to see somebody who's passionate about what they're doing. And the fact that you're taking the time to craft an email to tell them why you care about that company in particular, their mission, their brand, their purpose is very validating for them. But it also means you're less likely to quit as an employee, like 1 year out when you get a better offer from somebody else. So that's a big part of this process. The second piece you mentioned was, or that you hinted at anyway, was the question of who actually sees your application in each channel. And like we've talked a lot about this, I think, in various forums, maybe on podcasts and stuff before, but this difference between reach outs that go to recruiters and reach outs that go to hiring managers, and what the psychological difference is, and how that positions you from the company standpoint as either a promising or less promising, kind of more average candidate. Can you speak to that a little bit, and what the connection might be here between, the cold email response rates and like the job board response rate?
Absolutely. So this is something that plagues a lot of like technical hiring for technical roles, which is usually the first person that views your professional artifacts, like your resume, your LinkedIn profile, is a robot or a recruiter. And recruiters are usually non-technical. And so they rely on superficial signals, like where did you go to school? How many years of experience do you have? Things along those lines, because they can't usually establish a ground truth assessment of your abilities, and they're incentivized for a different thing. They're basically incentivized to not look foolish in front of the technical hiring managers. And if you look at the economics of it all, recruiter time is less expensive than hiring manager time. So, for example, if a recruiter really wanted to look foolish in front of her team, what he or she could do is basically forward a ton of candidates to the hiring managers. Like, these guys don't cut it. Why? Like, don't send me this type of people, because like they don't fit this criteria, and I just wasted so many expensive hours reviewing these when we could have just been all avoided if we were just like gated that off from the get-go. Whereas a hiring manager, because they're technical, they can in fact assess your abilities in a much more robust way. So reaching out to them directly is just a much higher probability of at least getting an honest assessment of your candidacy than going through the gatekeepers. And that's basically showcased in the differences in these response rates.
And just because we get this question a lot too, like hiring managers, for context, are the technical leads within companies who are responsible for hiring. So being a hiring manager, it's not a job title, it's a responsibility. So you might be like a senior data scientist, a team manager, a data science manager, something like that. And then you just like every time the team needs to hire, you take on this responsibility of hiring manager. You can find these folks on LinkedIn. They usually say like, I'm hiring, or they'll have titles like senior data scientist, team lead, technical team lead, and so on. And yeah, I mean, to your point, like you kind of get these recruiters who are a bit risk averse. They don't want to take a chance on a candidate, because the only way you can vet a candidate who doesn't have prior experience for like an entry-level role is really to look at their projects, their Jupyter notebooks, their deployed apps, what they've built. And you as a recruiter can't do that. And so the only people who are even in a position to vet entry-level talent are hiring managers. I mean, like that's the only way they have to look at your code, or they have to look at what you've built and assess it. Which I think that's one of the big traps. Like you said, I mean, you reach out through a job board, your resume is statistically going to be resume number 75 out of 150 that recruiter is reviewing over the course of a horrible 6-hour day. And you don't want to be there. You don't want somebody to be hungry and tired when your name comes up at the top of the pile. That's like a terrible way to introduce yourself to a company.
Exactly. So all of this is basically just trying to stack the chips in your favor. Like the job hunt process is probabilistic. It's fairly stochastic. And so there's like this long tail of like micro optimizations that you can add up to just boost your chances and increase your probability and eventually convert into that job offer. And unfortunately, when you're breaking into it, when it's your first role, that the odds are stacked even more sharply against you, in the sense that you have to go out of your way to signal your technical ability, because you don't have those years of experience that non-technical recruiters will often rely on just to give that initial first pass of, do we forward this candidate or not?
Awesome. And I think that context of who you're reaching out to is going to help to explain maybe the next plot that we're going to look at here, company response times, right? So maybe I'll just tee you off with this and ask, like, what is there's obviously, it seems like we're getting way faster responses maybe, sorry, I'll just mention quickly, we actually log the dates that all of these applications are put in through the Sharpest Minds job search assistant. So these actually reflect the time between when a candidate puts in an application and when they update it to say, oh, I got an interview or a response. So yeah, teeing it off there, Ali, go ahead and can you explain this?
Yes. So basically, like this dovetails from a lot of the context that we just shared in the previous slide, where like because job boards are such a more spray and pray approach, and because you have so many odds stacked against you in the sense that there's so many other applications in there with you. It's so much harder to rise above the noise. Job boards just tend to have like a much slower process overall, and part of that is reflected in response times. Whereas taking the time to email someone, land in their personal inbox and make a compelling case for why they should talk to you, just has much higher expected value than clicking easy apply yet another time. And interestingly enough, though, there isn't that big of a gap between cold email response times and LinkedIn reach out response times. And so I know we're saying like LinkedIn Easy Apply and LinkedIn Reach Outs, just to remind everybody,
Yeah,
LinkedIn
point.
Easy Apply is just job boards, right? It's just another example of a job board like Indeed.com, AngelList.com, et cetera. Whereas LinkedIn Reach Outs is a specific strategy of reaching out to either members on the data team or hiring managers themselves, people that are acting as hiring managers through DMs on LinkedIn. So just wanted to caveat that. But interestingly enough, response times on LinkedIn are like only 1 day slower than cold email. However, the thing to pair this with is in the previous slide is like the overall rate of responses. So it might take roughly the same amount of time, but you're actually getting overall more responses in the same unit of time. So what this is sort of all steering towards is this this equation that I think like underpins job hunting in general, which we'll get a little bit more into later, but I just want to kind of plant the flag here, which is this idea of interview yield per unit of effort. So you're going to have different outcomes from all these different strategies, different things that you can do. The key is really finding what's the thing that's going to give you the best yield per your unit of effort. And unit of effort here is a little bit subjective. Because for example, you might get like way better results with cold email, but maybe you just absolutely hate writing cold email.
Yeah.
That factors into the calculus, because if you hate doing it, it's less likely that you'll do enough of it such that you can get the outcome that you desire. And so, for example, that's why like having multiple options is a little bit helpful here, because you can just find the sustainable thing for you specifically. But I'll just park it there.
I think that's a great point. I mean, so take home message, and again, I'll just mention. So we're talking about response rates here. Again, this is not necessarily interview rates. We'll look at that in a moment. But this is like just hearing something back. And this really should be your first goal. Like, don't worry even about getting interviews. Worry about hearing something back. As you can see here, that's not a given. I mean, even these inflated job board numbers, we talked about them really, like in reality, the median numbers are 1 to 3%, something like that. That's like you're not hearing back. Basically, do not expect to hear back from a job board. So job boards give you no data. Basically, that's the problem. Right. They don't give you a plus or a minus. They give you nothing, right? So you're going to hear back much more often with cold email and LinkedIn, and you're going to hear back a lot sooner, about twice as fast. So your density of feedback, the density of information that you get about your application strategy, what's working, what's not, way, way higher, right? So that's got to be a big part of this calculation too.
And one really important thing on that is this ripples out further into the job hunt. And what I mean by that is job hunting is a skill. One of the skills that goes with the job hunting is, for example, interviewing, which is another skill that you want to develop. And so the faster the feedback loop is, the faster you can get better at it, the more exposure you can have to different hiring managers, to different situations, to different company contexts, to different take-home assignments, the better you will get at the overall process. And that in and of itself also incrementally adds the probabilities more and more in your favor. So like if I'm kicking off a job hunt next week, I'm going only cold email. That's just me. I personally enjoy writing. I feel like I communicate fairly strongly in a written form. And like seeing this data, like why would I not? I have much better response rates and I have to wait the least amount of time to hear back. So my overall throughput is going to be the highest with cold emailing. But that's just me because I like writing. Some people may not. So maybe some people, the right combination would be like LinkedIn reach outs, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And last thing I'll mention with these two plots or graphs is, what this doesn't show is the quality of the responses, of the information you get from these responses as well. If you are lucky enough to be one of the, I mean, yeah, 7% of people, I think it's more like one of the 2 to 3% of people who actually gets to hear back from a job board application. You're either going to get an interview, which is great, but if you get a no, it's just like a no. There's no explanation there.
Right.
Whereas if you bothered to send a cold email, you're much more likely to get a no that's informative. No, it turns out we're not actually hiring. So in other words, don't treat this as a negative.
Yes. Yes, 100%. And you just reminded me of something very important, which is one of the big benefits of LinkedIn reach outs in particular is if you basically hop on a call with someone on the data team or hiring manager, you can get the best feedback you're ever going to get
Yeah,
because they're representing their own opinion, not their company's. So for a whole host of legal reasons, like in a phone screen, in an interview, there's a limit to what your interviewer can tell you in terms of feedback, because it's just much easier to hedge the risk by saying don't give them any feedback because we don't want to run the risk of being sued for any discriminatory practices or anything like that.
yeah,
So just blanket statement, don't give them any feedback. Whereas in a informational interview that you could generate from a LinkedIn reach out, you can get such actionable feedback from like a senior data scientist saying like, hey, your skills in this and this are really good, but your model deployment is a little bit rusty. So I was like, we went over your code really quickly, like in this conversation, and like, it looks like you're doing some kind of funky things, or hey, we're actually using a different technology stack than what you're used to. For example, like you only know how to use, I don't know, Azure. We're all the way into AWS, so that's a little bit tricky, or whatever it is. You're going to get so much more actionable feedback from someone that can represent their own opinions as opposed to having to filter them through HR from the company.
yeah. That's a really good point, and I don't think most, especially entry level job seekers, are like aware that there's legal liability for company, like them giving you feedback. If you're ever lucky enough to get feedback from like a regular kind of job board formal application, uh, like lucky you, the company is basically exposing itself to legal risk for free just to tell you how to improve, and that's wonderful. There are great companies that do that, but there are strong reasons why companies avoid it, and I'm really glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah, and
Um,
even when companies do give you feedback, just one quick note on this is their incentive is to give you like very vanilla,
yeah,
non very actionable feedback. Like, yeah, no, you're a great candidate, but you don't quite fit the profile of what we're looking for. Well, like, that doesn't tell you anything.
yeah,
That's just like a no dressed up in like some polite terminology. Whereas like I think at least I personally would much rather get ruthlessly pragmatic feedback of like, no, your skills are just not good enough in this. And then I can like, oh, okay, great. Now I can go and spend a couple of weeks brushing up this skill, or maybe depending on skill, spend some more time. And then just it's much more actionable and it gives me something to work towards as opposed to just, oh, okay, that's just a no.
yeah. Fundamentally, like the job hunt is an information game, and I think most people don't approach it that way. But it really it is. You have to treat it like you're a data scientist, and you're actually going to try to collect data. And so yeah, number one, like collect data. Number two, treat it as an opportunity to build relationships. Like this is not something that comes easily to a lot of technical people, but it's a strategy that time after time works really, really well. Is if you can, like Ali said, like you send that LinkedIn message, you don't say, hey, I want to apply for a job. You say, hey, I'd love to talk to you about your role, about the kinds of things that keep you up at night at this company, about your passion for your work and so on. You're much more likely to get a conversation that leads to a referral, that leads to a much, much higher conversion rate job application from that process. So
That's exactly right.
awesome. All right. Application interview rates. This is the last of these kind of similar plots here, but I think this one is kind of interesting because it seems on the surface, I think we've got to explain a little bit why this looks so different from application response rates. We've dug into it a little bit. I'll just mention a couple things and then Ali, you can kind
Yeah.
of put the puck in the net. Very Canadian analogy. But so we started off here when we were talking about response rates. We said like basically this is the rate at which you're actually going to hear something back, right? So cold email, about a third of the time, that's pretty damn good. You're going to hear either a no, and usually that no will come with some kind of information, some reason why you're not a great fit or whatever, or a yes, which is great. Job boards, you pretty much only ever hear yes. Like if you apply through a job board, if you're going to hear back, like you're going to hear, yeah, we want to interview you. If they don't want to interview you, they'll ghost you because apparently companies are all like millennials or Gen Z people. Um, So looking at this, like that explains why job boards don't really move, right? 6.9%. I mean, really, it's just because we're showing an extra significant figure here too. It really is 7%. It doesn't really change. Just about all of these are interviews. All the responses are interviews. But cold email does collapse. I mean, it reduces a lot, right? 10% from 32%. So 2/3 of these are still going to be rejections. They're going to give you information and they're going to give you relationships. And you can leverage both. In fact, when we end up looking downstream at job offers, cold emails and LinkedIn do much, much better than job boards. So this actually does carry on forward very significantly, but it's worth noting, like these interviews themselves are they're teed up better because you have this relationship. So by the time you're actually interviewing, you're talking to the hiring manager, you've already spoken to them informally. They already kind of know you. So these convert with higher probability. So I think this kind of paints a bit of a misleading picture as well, because as we discussed, job boards in reality are more like 1 to 3%. So the real delta here is about 3x leverage. Whether you go through a cold email or LinkedIn, those are going to be about 2 to 3 times better, actually quite a bit more, I think, in reality, once you factor in all the conversion rates. But with that said, Ali, do you want to fill in those gaps?
Yeah, so just to echo something that you mentioned, if you think about it, like replying to job boards as a process is more expensive than replying to cold emails as a process, because you're just going to get so many less cold emails that taking the time to respond to someone who took the trouble to write you a personalized note with their candidacy after like doing all this research is much easier to say like, hey, I'm really sorry, we're actually like, we just filled this position, or hey, I think you're lacking in experience over here. That's much less expensive than responding to the thousands of applications that you get in a job board. And even if you were to respond to those, you would just get like an automated email saying like, hey, thank you for applying, but no thank you. So again, just like extracting like signal from these, you're just going to get so much more from cold email and LinkedIn reach outs. Also, one thing to note about LinkedIn reach outs that I think propagates forward is LinkedIn reach outs are a surprisingly good way to generate referrals, because you may be hopping on a call with like the data scientist on the team, and if he or she likes you, they can say, hey, let me actually put in a referral, or let me connect you directly to my boss who's like essentially making the hiring decision. And so that's not something that you're ever going to get through applying through a job board, for instance.
That's a really good point. Yeah. It's all this hidden stuff, right? I mean, it's easy to, even this data, which like, I don't think this data actually exists in any form on the internet. I don't think this is actually available. Like this is literally why we did this. But even looking at these plots, like there's so much more to uncover. It's not obvious from just looking at them. So it's really worth studying, like what is the interpretation of these numbers, so you don't end up going down the wrong path or trying something.
Exactly. Like we, I think, have are building the most like holistic data set on this particular aspect of the job hunting process. And even there's like layers to it. Yeah. So I think this is just like an artifact of how broken the process is fundamentally, and trying to navigate it without any data is just like you're setting yourself up for so much needless amounts of pain. So again, the whole reason why we're doing this is like we're just trying to bring the data to the process to give you more context, to allow you to make the best decisions with something as unknowingly painful as the job hunt can be.
I think that's a brilliant framing. And I'll say also, for anybody who's trying to like replicate this, obviously not everyone can or should start a mentorship or use our software. I think there are ways you can do this yourself. Yeah. So you can go to Airtable and track your own applications. Airtable is great. We recommend Airtable a lot, just because you can use this to like upload copies of your resume or cover letters that are tailored to each specific application and so on. Just really, I mean, find a way to track your stuff. But the bottom line is you should be tracking it, because you want to be able to compare how you're doing to these numbers. Like, unless you're tracking it, you can't tell if there's a problem. And then if there is a problem, you can't tell where it is. And I think this is another thing that really gets people kind of a bit lost in this process. They'll apply a whole bunch. They won't see a conversion to interviews. Their conversion rates will be crazy low. They'll not know if it's their fault or if it's just that the job search is bad or that they're not using the right strategy. And then they'll end up doing something completely disconnected from the actual problem at hand. If you're not generating interviews, ask yourself, what do I look like to companies at the moment I apply? Anything that doesn't change that is irrelevant. So in other words, what your references say about you is irrelevant. What your objective data science skills are is irrelevant, because typically the companies aren't interviewing you yet. They're not testing you. So,
Exactly.
don't do more digging into like textbooks and stuff. Ask yourself the first question. Yeah. How can I optimize what the immediate problem is right now? So I think that's something you can only do with this kind of data, which is why we're sharing it.
Yeah. So in brief summary, track everything. Without the numbers, it's just so much easier to fool yourself and come up with any type of rationalization or narrative that fits what you're seeing or not seeing. Whereas the better you track these numbers, the less you can lie to yourself, and the better decisions you can therefore make.
Yeah, and I think that includes as well the very decision of deciding to start the job search. If you look at these numbers and you're like, shit, I don't think I can do this. Like this is just not, I have a job that's good enough. I don't want to be sending like, I don't want to have a 10-to-1 ratio of like
Right.
cold emails to like, okay, well then you've made an informed decision and that's great. But this is just the cold reality. We really don't want to be hyping data science or jobs. Like this is just the truth. And if this is for you, that's awesome and you should do it, but do it with this context in mind. Cool. Okay, this is a fun plot. I'll just explain what this is, and then Ale, maybe I'll ask you to kind of provide some commentary again. So what we're looking at here is we have a bunch of people who apply to Sharpest Minds as mentees. They'll tell us what skills they have going in. So these are people who are looking for work, and this shows you basically a distribution of what are the tools that like the average data science applicant, data analytics applicant, MLE applicant, these are the things that they know. And maybe with that teaser, Ale, what are your thoughts on this?
So much like when we were discussing different application strategies, you should track everything so you can know where not to follow the crowd. So here, everybody has Python. Everybody does pandas. What that means is when you're actually applying for roles, instead of like, showing another Jupyter notebook doing some exploratory data analysis, what you should be showing is here's how I deployed this model into production, or here's how I was able to mimic production level workflows in this project. Because as you can see by the data, less people have that skill. So you're already more competitive in that area. Whereas again, if you're just showcasing your Python pandas and SQL skills, that's what everybody already has. So like there's no marginal advantage for you to leverage. And again, the same thing applies with like cold email. Like everybody's sending job board applications. Every people are sending cold emails. Don't go where the crowd is, or you're going to get like average results.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so these skills, there's a reason we ask about these skills in the onboarding part of our process. Like we have an army of like, I don't know what it is, 500, 600 mentors now. And we ask them on a regular basis, like, what is the tech stack that your company is hiring for? And they will tell us, and this essentially distills fundamentally what we see on at least the data science track, maybe not analytics, that's sort of a different story. But the bottom line is, you look at this and it's like, well, okay, everybody needs Git. Everybody needs some kind of cloud like AWS, GCP. It doesn't really matter, but some kind of cloud thing. They need some ability to build cool stuff. And I would say, Flask, Django, or Streamlit tools, even that make it really easy, some way of getting your work in front of people. Like these are really good ways to distinguish yourself from other people. That's what this plot tells you, like Ale was saying. I mean, like everything's saturated up here with Python, Pandas, SQL, Matplotlib, sklearn. Everyone's like, instead of making a sixth project with like Pandas, scikit-learn, Jupyter Notebook, that sort of thing, maybe try branching out and learning some of these getting shit done skills like Git, cloud, and so on. So, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Ali.
So I was just going to say like two quick things on this. Most mentorships, if you were to like take a snapshot of like skills before and after, most mentorships basically focus on bringing up like the right side of this graph, bringing those skills up. Because again, those are skills that are like much more in demand and much more marketable, and less people have them coming in. But also something that we've seen repeatedly is, if you'll notice, this is a lot of the stuff you guys are going to learn in like a boot camp or in a master's program. And while it's useful, it doesn't quite map to the reality of what the market is selecting for. And so, for example, we have a lot of people that are like, they just completed their masters in big data and they can crush it with Python, Pandas, and SQL, but you're not operating in a walled garden inside of a company. You need to be able to bubble up this analysis to other people. You need to basically be able to integrate to whatever their infrastructure is, such that you can communicate these insights to the stakeholders that are going to be making decisions. And so what the rest of these skills allow you to do is, as Jeremy, as you pointed out, is like put your work in front of others.
Yeah. And okay, so yeah, there's so many excellent points there. I think at the end of the day, it really is what Ali, what you were saying about, not following the herd. If you want to get hired, like, you cannot look like everybody else. And these tools, these techniques, they are in demand. When you don't have them, it looks really bad. And there's actually I think almost a boot camp principle that it's an economic principle of boot camps that is really unfortunate. But the really good boot camps, like the world's best boot camps, start off excellent because they're teaching exactly the stuff that other people aren't teaching. Then they grow, and then they start to take on hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of students. And then eventually they saturate the market with these students who all know the same shit. So at the end of the day, it like you end up, by the time you've noticed a really great boot camp, you're in that situation. This is actually, I mean, as a tangential, this is really why we focus on mentorship. We think like customization one-on-one so that every mentorship is different and bespoke. Really, you want to be able to not look like everybody else. That has to be your main goal. You don't have to use a mentorship to do it, but like, keep in mind, like, what are people looking for in the market that's not, where that need is not being met. And you can do that by looking at job board postings and seeing like, what are some of the skill sets that are here, compare that to like what people seem to be focusing on in boot camps today. That delta is a really good hint. That maps exactly onto this stuff right here. So anyway, just something to keep in mind in terms of the philosophy of this stuff.
Yep, aggressively agree with what you just said.
Awesome. Okay, let's get to the money. All right, so these are I really like to show these plots because I think, again, it's another area where like we have this kind of, I mean, call it insider data. I don't want to like overhype this, but it is real data from like hundreds of mentees who've been hired, and this shows you really, when you're negotiating salary, you should know about this plot. This shows you how people are actually being paid. This is a plot of US salaries. If you're Canadian, we have bad news for you that we'll share in a minute. But maybe, I don't know if there's anything specific you want to share about this, Ali. Do you have any thoughts about this piece?
Just that, and so one of the things that I help a lot of mentees with is like negotiating their salaries. And something that I've kind of learned over the last year is there are certain cultural norms that some mentees bring with them that preempt them from feeling comfortable with negotiating. And one of the things that I've had to explain repeatedly is that like negotiation is like an expected part of the process in the Western world. It's what competent and serious professionals do. And so you're trying to pattern match against that. And so you should negotiate for like a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that it's like an incredibly asymmetric bet. Like, you don't really lose anything by asking, but you forgo all the upside by just defaulting to not asking. And in most cases, the higher the starting salary is in the initial offer, the more positive delta there is in the negotiation. So it doesn't apply for everyone in all contexts, but as a general heuristic, I would just say be more open to negotiating. It's such an asymmetric thing to do that you might as well do it.
Okay, so I think that you have some really fun insights to share about the salary negotiation process. We do not have plots that directly relate to this, partly because I think we don't want to share like confidential information about specific cases here. But I think that this is a great opportunity to pick your brain a little bit on the salary negotiation process. So you laid out so many things. Let me ask the first question that we've heard from mentees a million times. But Alejandro, I just got a job offer and I'm scared to negotiate because what if they take it away from me? What if they say, oh, you want to negotiate? We're done here. We can't pay that higher salary. Get out of here.
Right. So that's like a really seemingly rational fear that I believe comes from a bit of a scarcity mindset, because you just went through this entire slog of like of rejection, of fear, of constantly expending more effort to make it all this way here, where you finally have an offer and it's like, I'm finally there. So obviously you're going to be understandably risk averse at that point, where you don't want to do anything to jeopardize that, because it's like you are at the 1 inch mark from your goal. And so anything that puts that in any amount of risk just seems completely unacceptable. The miscalculation there is the risk. There is basically 0% chance, effectively 0% chance that someone will rescind an offer just because you're trying to negotiate, especially if you're doing it like in good faith. If you like send out an email saying like, hey, this is enough, either increase by 10K or like go screw yourself, yeah, they'll probably rescind an offer because they're like, we just don't want to work with this individual that doesn't fit our culture and our values. But if you are able to negotiate in good faith, and we've done this so many times, we can show you exactly how to do it. Um, there's only really two outcomes that can happen. They either increase your base compensation or some other element of your compensation package, which is great for you, or they say no. And if they say
Right.
no, you're exactly where you were a moment ago, but at least you exhausted the opportunity of increasing your salary. And one other important thing on like salary that most people don't realize is like the long-term implications of even an extra 5K. Like think about how that compounds over the next 30 years of your life if you just put that extra 5K in the market. Like that's over the span of 30 years at some decently compounding rates, like the historical market average, you're talking about tens, if not like $100,000 delta that you can get with one well-crafted email. So why would you ever not take that opportunity?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's also worth remembering that like pay raises are expressed in percentage terms, not
Right.
absolute numbers. You don't get a $10,000 raise or a $5,000 raise. You get a 5% raise or a 10% raise if you're really lucky. But the point is, if you start with a higher base number, if your salary is 105%, sorry, 105K rather than 100K, and you get a 10% raise, well, that's 500 extra bucks that you're getting per year, which then compounds the next year with the next raise. So these things
Exactly.
really do, yeah, to your point. I mean, there's so many ways in which this is worth doing. It also sends a powerful signal because valuable people will tend to understand the value that they bring. They will tend to argue for that value, and they will tend to negotiate salary. I think probably, and this is somewhat one of our, I think, biggest failures in the salary negotiation side. We did have a mentee. There was one case we've seen where an offer was actually turned down, or sorry, withdrawn after a salary negotiation. I think it's worth flagging. Like
Yes.
this is one out of it's
Hundreds.
hundreds, but it is one. So the risk is like, place that in your mind somewhere in that range. It is true. There's that edge risk.
It's a non-zero chance. However, I am of the opinion that it effectively rounds to zero again if you do it right. But
Yeah.
it is something where like we can't say it's risk-free.
Yeah, and this, I think it was also compounded by COVID and stuff. But anyway, I think this is just part of us. Like, we want to really make sure that people think of this responsibly. If you have a very, very low risk tolerance, yeah, okay, maybe accept it. But very rare, especially one thing that that didn't happen for various reasons in that case, but that you should always do when you negotiate salaries, give a clear reason why you need that bump. Say like, hey, I'm really excited to work at your company. So number one, be sure to make that point. And I'm very excited about the offer, blah, blah, blah. I'm moving, or I'm at a stage in my life where I'm looking to have a kid or buy a house or something like that, or pay off some college debts. And an extra 3K would really make a big difference here. Is that something that you'd be open to doing? And if they say no, like, it's clear that you're still okay with the base. It's just a
Right.
question of, will they make you a little bit more happy? And that's really what you're getting at here, is expressing your openness to.
Exactly. And what you should definitely not do is you shouldn't bluff saying, "Hey, I got another offer from a company that's like $15,000 more. What can you do?"
Yes.
Because if you frame it in that way, it's much easier to turn you down because they're like, "Oh, well, they already have another offer. Like even if we turn them down, there's something else there. They'll be fine." And they're like, "We can't match that." So you by framing it that way, you make it into a binary decision on hiring you, no, not just saying yes or no to the extra compensation. So definitely don't bluff, negotiate in good faith.
Yeah, and that, I think that's a through line. Like, you want to conduct the entire job search as ethically as you possibly can, because that will, like, people will notice, they will see, if you're not that kind of person, it will come across. And you want to work in an environment that respects ethics. Otherwise, like, it could be a nightmare. So you're always better off doing that. Okay, awesome. There's a whole bunch more to say about negotiation, but I want to stay at least somewhat on topic here.
Maybe we'll
So
have a conversation one day on just negotiation.
there we go. Great. So here's our plot just for Canadian job seekers here. This is pretty dismal. These numbers are in Canadian dollars, whereas the previous ones were in American dollars. So as of right now, I think a Canadian dollar is like 80% of an American dollar. So the upshot is, you're going to get paid about half once you finish adjusting for currency to work as a data professional. Here, it looks like the mean is somewhere around 70, maybe 80. The median's around 70. Whereas like in the US, you're talking, you know, a mean around 100,
Yeah.
something like that, maybe a bit more. Yeah, so keep that in mind. I mean, like your geography really matters increasingly as companies are remote. Like, you know, that may shift, but for now, this is really what we're seeing. You know, if you're in Canada, don't expect those Silicon Valley salaries just yet.
Right. But I will say one thing that like Canada does make up for in this regard is it's a lot more accessible for international students. Whereas in the US, there's a time limit basically to when you can land an offer. And if you don't land it within that time limit, you have to leave the country.
Yeah.
Canada makes it just lowers the activation energy required to go from international student to like legally able to work in Canada. So while the absolute salaries are lower, the overall like pathway is a bit wider for especially for international folks. So I just wanted to flag that too.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I'm glad you tossed that in there too, because I think we've been very Canada and US centric in our analysis here. That's because that's the market we know. So we're just sharing that data. But yeah, worth noting as well, if you're interested in this stuff, you know, the whole US OPT H-1B visa circuit, you can, if you're strategic, avoid that, work in Canada first. And who knows, you get hired across the border at a US company remotely in post-COVID times. So there we go.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Last plot I've got here is hires by job title. I indicate this to give a sense of like where the bias is in our data set. It is not the case that SharpestMinds represents like a perfect distribution, balanced distribution across, you know, machine learning researchers, ML engineers, data analysts, and so on. This just shows you where our biases are. The vast majority of our mentees are either data scientists or aiming to become data scientists or data analysts. Yeah, and ML researchers, they're like minor, it's like, I don't know, 3% or something of our total. But Ali, do you see anything here you want to highlight?
Yeah, I just want to expand on like the other category. These are there's basically like a subset of companies that somewhere in the last few years realized like, oh, we need to be data driven, and in a somewhat jargony way, try to like compile different weird names to like fit that. So you'll have like some other is like kind of an all-encompassing category for like anything from like a product analyst to an analytics engineer to like some other weirder, wackier names that don't neatly fit into some of these other categories. So I just wanted to give some context there.
That's a really good point. There is some editorializing that goes in here. Like, you know, not all jobs that we cite under data engineer here, like have the job title data engineer. Some of them have job titles that are clearly kind of belong to that family, that umbrella. And if you're wondering what we, like how we define these terms, they follow, I think I wrote I wrote an article a while ago for Towards Data Science called Don't Be a Data Science Generalist, I want to say. Essentially, we're following those definitions. So we have a very clear definitions of what we mean by data engineer, ML engineer, data analyst, and so on. You can check those out there, and maybe we'll post a link to it as well. I hate to self-plug, but it really, those are the definitions we use. So when we do the onboarding for mentees, basically if you go through the SharpestMinds application process, you will end up telling us like which of these you're interested in becoming. That's where this data comes from. And we will provide those definitions there as well. Cool. I mean, so I think that's our grand tour. Ali, do you have any final thoughts you want to share about this process or stuff you learned?
I have a request for the audience, which is like we try to cover as much ground as we could, but obviously like there's only so much time. If there's other questions that you guys have, other stats that you guys would be interested in seeing, please forward them our way. I think like this conversation was incredibly fun and hopefully illuminating. But if there's more that you guys would like to learn about, please feel free to send us your questions.
We'll post it on YouTube, so YouTube comments, or you can always send us an email. Like go to our website, and we have a contact form. Any mechanism you want to use.
Yep. Or you guys can also email us at contact@sharpestminds.com. And
there you go.
Any questions you guys have.
I believe that goes into all of our collective inboxes because we love spam.
I may regret saying that now.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Well, I doubt we're gonna get an inflood here, but yeah, I mean, feel free to get in touch with us, folks. And thanks, Ali. This is great.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.